So let me invite Carmen up to the screen. And Carmen is saying, if there have been so many advances in the knowledge of the brain and behaviors, in my opinion, why do professionals, especially in the field of education, continue to learn and apply behaviorist theories that pretend to homogenize their neurodivergent students and clients? So in other words, looking at just behavior, not at the brain beneath the behavior. And Carmen, I'm inviting you up, but I don't see, there, now you're coming, great. Why are we still not able to differentiate and honor the neurodivergent experiences by being more curious and respectful of their differences in attention, executive functions, learning, and sensory integration? That is a great question to start with. Hi, Carmen.
Hi.
Hi, where are you reaching us from?
I'm here in Toronto,
In
in
Toronto.
Canada. Yeah,
Wonderful, wonderful. I hope your summer is not so hot.
it's getting better.
It's getting better. Good, 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 good. Do you want to say more about your question? It's such a really clearly articulated question and such an important question about our broad field of, mental well-being, which would include education, like you're pointing out, as well as mental health and parenting and probably all humans. So do you want to say a little more about the question? I have things I want to ask you about too, and then I'm happy to give you my reflections too.
Thank you. Well, I'm a psychologist. I feel that you need to know a little bit of my background before
Please.
I answer my question.
Yes.
Well, I'm a newcomer here in Canada. I'm a psychologist. I'm from Chile,
From
South
Chile.
America. Yeah.
Magnifico.
Uh, yeah, so I'm here, and in order to be a psychologist here, I need my master. So in the meantime, I'm an EA. I'm working as an educational assistant. That's why I'm asking from specifically the educational field. Um, so in my experience, when I started to work with the neurodivergent community, it's been 6 years now since I've been working solely with the autistic community specifically. So I found that the main strategy or approach that in North America is used is ABA. So it's a more behaviorist approach. And I noticed right away that it's very difficult to see practitioners being curious about the mind behind the behaviors. It's tough. As an EA, it's more tough because you see people that is not trained well about the development of the brain or child development. So it's very, I became very worried right away. So my question is, if we know so much about the brain now, if there's more research, if the decade of the brain like began like 20 years ago or more, 30 years ago.
1990. Yeah, 30 years,
Yeah.
33 years ago.
So why is that we're not using that knowledge in education? Why aren't we tailored plans for the kids in order to feel safe and learn and communicate?
Yeah. Yeah, such a beautiful question. So let me give you some responses, and I want to be very respectful of everyone's approach having validity. And at the same time, your question's inviting us to be very frank about some possible reasons for this issue. So um, let me begin with a simple story, which is I was once teaching in Germany, and I taught a day about teaching uh, these folks about mind sight and about looking at the mind beneath behavior, like you're saying, and how important it was for parents. This was a group of people interested in parenting. How important it was for parents to really understand the emotional life of their child, the motivations of their child, the perceptions, the sensations, the memories, the point of view, the beliefs, all that we call mind, what was beneath the outwardly visible behaviors. And it was a wonderful day, great day. And the next day, there was a very prominent um, parenting expert who was also brought to speak to this group of parents. Um, and I had never heard him speak, so I wanted to hear it. And it was a purely behaviorist approach to parenting. And one of his first statements in the first half hour of his day that he had with these exact same parents was, parents should never try to understand the emotions of their child, because they will always be wrong in their guesses, and they should just respond to what they're absolutely sure of, which is the behavior they see in front of their eyes. It was amazing. So the parents in the room who knew I was in the back, but I don't think he was familiar with me, so he didn't know I was sitting in to watch him, they all turned to me with looks of like desperation on their face and puzzlement. And then one of them even asked, well, we heard yesterday that somebody, said, we should look in the inner life of the child. And he said, no, you'll always be wrong. You'll never know. So just stick with what you're sure of. You're sure of what you see. You're not sure of what you're guessing at. So that was the first thing. So I asked this person, the professor, to, go to dinner with me and alone. We talked about this, and sure enough, his attitude was that you can only be sure of what you can measure, and you can only measure what you can observe, and behavior is what you observe. Emotions, you just see their behaviors. You can't really measure the emotions, even if you know about the brain, because he didn't know anything about the brain. So he wasn't really interested in the brain because you couldn't see it and you couldn't measure it in the kinds of studies he was doing. Anyway, he claimed to have the most effective parenting approach on the planet and all this kind of stuff. But as an attachment researcher, I know that parents that have this reflective function that really seek to understand the mind beneath behavior have children who do better in the sense that they can regulate their own emotions, that they know themselves, they have a coherent narrative, they have a sense of an inner compass, they have a resilience. He's measuring behavioral outcomes. So he's measuring how children learn to, follow the rules, and not cause trouble. That's his outcome measures. Literally, those are his outcome measures. So, he can have a really productive outcome measure, effective, because he's picking what he wants to do. Is your behavior being regulated? And he's giving, classical behaviorist approaches, give positive reinforcement for the behaviors you observe that you want. And you're not at all addressing the inner life of the child. And the studies, as we've discussed, where parents don't reflect on the inner life of the child, have children who don't really know their inner life. So then they may go on to become behaviorists too. So to put it simply like that, 20% of the population, at least in the United States, probably in Canada too, likely have this extreme, which we call the avoidant pattern of attachment. And therefore, they weren't given much emotional closeness. They were certainly behaviorally regulated, so they weren't ignored. Their behaviors were observed. So in brain terms, the way to understand it is the mind-sight networks are a potential on almost every human being. There are some neurodivergent situations like autism spectrum that may be especially challenging, that we can talk about. But, the networks are mostly available. But if you don't train them, just like the ability to ride a bicycle is in everyone, but if you never had the opportunity to get on a bike, even though those networks are potentially able to be trained, they weren't trained. So you're not a bike rider. It's kind of like that. And so probably those non-bike riding behaviorist folks just do what they know, which is how to walk, even though there's a bike sitting there. And they go, I'm not interested in wheels and gears and brakes. I walk. Walking is the only way to get around. You go, well, actually, this bike is pretty fun. And they go, well, I don't believe in bikes or something like that. So it's probably that kind of analogy. So now, in terms of the second part of your question, the problem with that is exactly like you're saying. When you don't look under the hood, and see what's going on, then you don't have this opportunity to understand more deeply the divergence that's there, So Elizabeth is saying she was just at Esalen. We were there at this wonderful gathering, but there what you saw was there were many different types of people there, and I knew some people were on the different um, neurodivergence ways of being, and that was all beautiful. You all had different ways, and when you understood that there were different networks that either were accessible or had been trained, you have a new way of just sensing behavioral differences as coming from a deep place of love, even though
Mm.
they're expressed in different ways. And so, even as I had dinner with this behaviorist professor guy, I took a deep breath and I said, okay, this is his worldview. Is he hurting anyone? No, he's not really hurting anyone, except when he says that line. And I push back on him, parents shouldn't
Mm.
guesstimate what the emotion is. I said, I don't agree with you. And he said, yeah, but you can't measure how accurate they are. I said, that's not the point. You can sense whether someone feels felt and tuned in. And we measure that with what's called secure attachment. So, anyway, it's so great to have this question, because when you do go into the whole inner energy flow of both what's happening, not just in the head brain, but throughout the body, and then what's happening in our relationships, this is what we try to do here in this course. You do get a feeling for deep acceptance and insight into your own inner experience, into your relational experiences, into other bodies and what they go through. And there's a kind of beautiful love that comes out that is really what we're hoping to cultivate in the world. Not just behavioral control, but a sense of belonging and inclusion and identity that embraces the diversity of ways these energy flow patterns may be molded by your networks in your nervous system, like you're pointing out,
Mm.
Carmen. How does that sit with you?
Yeah, I love your answer. It looks like it's like a curiosity emergency in professionals because
Exactly.
yeah, we need to
Yeah.
be more curious.
And
So
more
foster
curious. And,
kindness
I had
and
a
empathy.
Yeah, I had a funny interaction once with a teacher. It was public, so I can say Barry Brazelton. He never talked about the brain, and someone asked him about it. Me, I asked him about it when he was getting kind of agitated about talking about the brain. And then he said, he just felt uncomfortable because it wasn't how he was trained. He didn't know anything
Mm.
about it, and he felt like it was too overwhelming to try to learn about the brain. But I hope in this course, and Barry was so courageous to be so honest about his limitations, um, you know, that I hope this course is making it accessible. And so you can feel that it's not only understandable, but actually very useful.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
it is.